Hey everybody, so I just read this book by Bill Gates called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster and the Solutions We Have and the Breakthroughs We Need, because I thought it would be interesting to read it. And it's not just him writing this himself. He's got access to the world's leading experts in many sectors of the economy. So it's kind of like it was like they helped write it with him, so they had a lot of input. So I'll just get started. The key thing that he puts out, he says we need to get to net zero carbon, which he used the analogy of a bathtub being half full. If you turn the flow of the water into the bathtub down to like 10%, or even down to a drip, you're still adding to the overall volume of water in the bathtub, and it will eventually overflow. So he says we need to turn it all the way to zero, turn it completely off. And so that's what he says we need to do with carbon. And I think I can't remember which year he says we need to reach net zero carbon by, but it's maybe by 2050. I don't remember, but and then he mentioned the green premiums are an obstacle to that. And green premiums has to do with if you switch from coal to some alternative energy, how much more is that going to cost the average consumer? That's a green premium. So he says, yeah, the green premiums need to be shrunk down. So he touched on things like we need to change the way we make cement and steel, and he says we need to make low carbon cement, and apparently there's ways to do that. So the inputs to making the cement are causing a lot less pollution. He talked about next generation nuclear fission, which I'll touch more on in a moment. He talked about carbon capture and sequestration. He talked about wind power, especially offshore wind power, because offshore, I think offshore is going to have much more reliable wind source. I think that's going to blow much more all the time. He's talked about cellulosic ethanol, a type of biofuel. Talked about meat alternatives, alternative hamburgers that aren't meat hamburgers. Talked about other things having to do with agriculture, especially things like fertilizer, how it's applied. Talked about electric vehicles, and he did mention electric vehicles aren't there's going to be a lot of improvements made. You plug your electric vehicle into an outlet that gets its energy from coal-fired plants, like I remember reading years ago about a guy in Boulder that owns a house in Boulder with solar panels. The excess energy from the solar energy goes into a big battery in his garage, and then he plugs his electric car into that battery, which essentially makes his electric car solar powered. But then he talks about the government regulations and rules and how they're outdated, but he says we need a lot of innovation to reach certain goals, and he says he's confident with all the experts he's consulted with that big things can be accomplished. One interesting note, he takes his son, back in the, maybe not anymore, but back when his son was younger, they would go for fun, they would go on tours of power plants, because they're very curious about how power plants are run. As far as architecture, he pointed out there's a building in Seattle called the Bullitt Center, and that's Bullitt, and it's the greenest commercial office building in the world. And it gets all its energy needs from its solar roof. It's a 14,000 square foot solar panel roof that provides 245,000 kilowatt hours of energy per year. And in the last 7 years, it's produced more energy than it needs. So the excess energy flows to the grid. And that's especially interesting considering that Seattle has a lot of cloudy days. But it's a 6-story, 50,000 square foot building. It has 26 400-foot deep geothermal wells below the basement, of course, and it accesses that heat with pumps for its radiant floor heating and cooling system. Then it also has all this huge setup in the basement to recycle all its waste, including from the restrooms. Obviously, not every building can build a building. You can't build buildings that have access to 26 400 feet deep geothermal wells. So, but it's interesting. There's progress to be made, and but that's interesting that this building called the Bullitt Center actually is net negatives carbon. It actually returns power to the grid that it doesn't need. Then the biggest issue probably is nuclear power, because he pointed out how there's zero carbon from nuclear energy. Right now, he says the U.S. gets 20% of its energy needs from nuclear power. France is the #1 country with 70% of its energy needs from nuclear power. He mentioned that solar and wind worldwide produce a total of 7% of the world's energy needs. So solar and wind are never going to do it all, but they will be a piece of the puzzle. They're a puzzle piece in the puzzle. But Bill Gates is a founder of a nuclear well, I guess I'll just call it a nuclear company called TerraPower. But it's basically where they're studying nuclear fission. They're studying how to researching and how to make better reactors much more efficient. And no, they aren't doing any actual nuclear stuff at their facility in Bellevue, Washington. They're doing all this through supercomputers. But I went to the TerraPower website, and I'll try to remember to put a link to that. But it's the #1 thing it looks like they're working on, like he mentioned in his book. It's called the Traveling Wave Reactor. It can use several different types of fuels. It can use waste from other nuclear facilities. It produces far less waste than today's plants. And it's also fully automated, so that eliminates human error. And it has a much higher thermal efficiency, and it has a much safer design, which it automatically prevents overheating. And it says that a fleet of traveling wave reactor plants will be able to operate for centuries with unenriched uranium fuel. It is 30 times more efficient. It has a 30 times more efficient use of mined uranium and a factor of 5 reduction in waste. And again, there's no safety or proliferation concerns, so you don't have to worry about proliferation, using that uranium for other uses. So all that's interesting stuff. So I guess, probably the biggest #1 thing is we got to, decide, are we going to use more coal or more nuclear? So go and put a comment, see what do you think about that. What would you prefer, more nuclear or more coal? And I was also going to say, even if it's proven 100% that man does not contribute to global warming, shouldn't we want to do things to clean the air and water? I mean, I live in downtown Denver. I would like to breathe cleaner air, but right now I cannot buy a cabin in the mountains. But when you look at downtown Denver from the distance on many days, especially in the winter, you'll see a brown cloud. Shouldn't we want to get rid of that? I would think so, but now there is one thing that concerns me that he mentioned, which, I'm good with preserving and protecting, nature and the environment, but I draw the line when you try to play the role of nature, when you're trying to be nature itself. And so he mentioned, this is on page 176 in his book, he mentioned geoengineering. He says it's a break glass in case of emergency kind of tool. The basic idea is to make temporary changes in the Earth's oceans or atmosphere that lower the planet's temperature. See, that right there kind of, anytime you're talking about doing stuff like that, experiments like that in the atmosphere, there's going to be side effects. There just is. Nature is a very intricate system, and you can't play nature. You can protect it and preserve it, but to play the role of nature. So he goes on to say, to compensate for all the warming caused by greenhouse gases we've added to the atmosphere, we need to reduce the amount of sunlight hitting the earth by about 1%. Goes on to say, there are various ways we could do that. One involves distributing extremely fine particles, each just a few millionths of an inch in diameter, in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Scientists know that these particles would scatter sunlight and cause cooling because they've watched it happen. When an especially powerful volcano erupts, it spews out a similar type of particle and measurably drives down the global temperature. I would like to let the volcano do that, not man, but another approach to geoengineering involves brightening clouds. Because sunlight is scattered by the tops of clouds, we could scatter more sunlight and cool the earth by making the clouds brighter, using a salt spray that causes clouds to scatter more light, and it wouldn't take a dramatic increase to get the 1% reduction. We'd only need to brighten clouds that cover 10% of the Earth's area by 10%. And let's see, he goes on to say the effects on clouds last for a week or so we could use them as long as we needed to and then stop with no long-term impacts. So again, that kind of makes me a little nervous. I just don't think, I'm not for that sort of thing. I don't think we should be messing with nature like that. And you're spraying stuff in the atmosphere, trying to cool the Earth's temperature, dimming the amount of sunlight we get. I just think that's sketchy, and I don't feel comfortable with that. There's a bunch of other stuff in this book that we should take a look at. But geoengineering and spraying stuff in the sky to reflect sunlight and cool the Earth's temperature and turn down the amount of sunlight that gets here, that's I don't like that. He says what's fair to say is that we need to better understand the potential impact of geoengineering at a local level. That's a legitimate concern that deserves much more study before we even consider testing geoengineering at scale in the real world. Also, because the atmosphere is literally a global concern, no single nation could decide to try geoengineering on its own. We need some consensus. So, yeah, again, that's the one thing I don't like is spraying stuff in the atmosphere to try to play the role of nature, because, you know, you alter this one little thing, then it can alter something, you know, maybe it alters the temperature just enough in the ocean where it kills off some fish, and, you know, the ecosystem's pretty fragile, and I don't think we should be doing, I personally would vote no on doing geoengineering in the skies. But anyways, that's, you know, what I've read in this book, and we'll see what happens in the future. So have a good day, everybody.